Mr. President, fellows and guests, it is a great honor for me to present today some of the continental work done during the last few years on understanding the moon-based culture of the Celts. Since there is in England a much longer tradition of archaeoastronomical work in this field, but the newer finds mainly stem from the continental Europe, I hope that within the premises of the Society of Antiquaries I will be able to hear today your learned views, and I'm very much looking forward for a lively debate. Today, we will have a view of the world of the Celts, the people living in southern Germany and in the center of France from roughly 850 BC onwards. Using the word Celtic, Celts for a group of rather heterogeneous groups is a canful of words, but I would like to ask you kindly to forgive me for using it today just for the sake of simplification. We will meet today some important finds from the core areas in Burgundy, Bressay, Courtesul and Dierville, and southern Germany, Magdalenenberg, Dattingen, Hoochdorf and Glauberg, mainly datable within the Celtic so-called Hallstatt period. Just in case you think, as I commence, that you have come to the wrong place and should be in the hall of the Royal Astronomical Society, please bear with me as I explain the scientific background to the lunar processes which were described by the ancient sources. To understand astronomical concepts of early humanity, we must leave our brainwashed views based on the Hubble telescope astronomy established by Galileo and Copernicus since the Renaissance. Instead, we must deal with how humanity dealt with a geocentric understanding of the world and how they looked at the sky above us. From the Earth-concentric point of view, they recognized that each star and each constellation had annual fixed rising points at the eastern horizon, which never changed. However, the rising points of the Sun and Moon did vary considerably within each year. For instance, for the Moon, even within each month. For the normal observer, the Sun was swinging between its summer and winter solstice within 1 year, visible at its elevation in the open sky and at its risings and settings at the horizon. Today, there is only a vague awareness of this solar phenomenon left by those people who take out the dog each morning. Awareness about the path of the Moon looks like, let alone its oscillation around the solar path, is nowadays practically unknown, and yet it is even more spectacular. The Moon is swinging between its extreme points in the elevated sky and at the horizon, back and forwards within 1 month. It is important to notice that when the Moon is rising every 18.6 years at its most extreme point towards the south, so outside the area up to where the Sun rises, the Moon also has its lowest position towards the southern horizon and stands only 11 degrees above it, which is very, very low. Alternatively, one could describe these processes like a kind of cosmic breathing. The lunar rhythmic swinging is embedded within a much slower yearly solar pulse. In this diagram, you can see the slow movement of the Sun against the fast monthly movements of the Moon. The places where the lunar standstills are situated at the horizon are very diagnostic. In this diagram, limited by the light and darker brown areas. For any geocentric observer, there were 2 important moon cycles discernible. In this diagram, the months of the year, starting at the spring month, March, are displayed horizontally. Vertically, the rows are the years listed between 630 BC above and to 581 BC at the bottom, which covers roughly the early Celtic period. The first cycle is based on the lunar eclipses, which occur in this diagram shown as grey and black events, backwards moving through the years from the upper right to the lower left of this diagram at intervals of 5 to 6 months. The reoccurrence of a lunar eclipse in the same month happens every 18.11 years, the so-called Saros cycle. The second cycle is based on the moonrise and moonset extremes, the major lunar standstills, horizontal red bands, and the minor lunar standstills, the horizontal blue bands, which both occur every 18.6 years alternately. For the normal observer, it was easy to establish the year of the major lunar standstill by observing the spring eclipse in March, first column on the left, combined with the lowest position of the moon at midsummer of the same year. However, these two cycles are not entirely compatible, whereas the Saros cycle could be harmonized with the solar cycle by adding one lunar year to make a precise 19-year solar cycle. The start of the consequent lunar standstill cycle, due to its length of 18.6 years, was between 18 or 19 years. For this reason, the Saros cycle was ideal for calendar purposes, whereas the lunar standstill cycle was not. This eclipse cycle of the moon, the Saros cycle, was already used in Mesopotamia as the fundamental base of their calendar. The intercalary months necessary to fit the moon cycles with the solar years was canonized around 500 BC. As you can see in this diagram, where the regularly attested intercalary months start to show a stable pattern around 500 BC. Whereas before, to the left, these intercalary months were set at random, each event decided individually by the king. The canonized system was taken over by the Greeks 50 years later, notably by Thom. The quest for a stable lunar calendar can be pursued in different ways. The Mesopotamians, followed by the Greeks and Romans, worked basically with this 19-year Thom cycle. Pliny, however, reports that the Celts were using a 30-year cycle, which is not known from any of the Mediterranean cultures. If one looks at the third line of this table, one can see that trying to fit the most simple cycle, 12 lunar months, it results in 354.7 solar days, which fall 10.88 days short of the real solar year cycle of 365.24 days. Hence, the simplest cycle has an error of 10.88 days, the third line and the last column on the far right of the table. The trick was then to multiply the number of lunar months until it fitted a certain amount of solar years, always accompanied by a pattern of intercalary months. If one took, for instance, 37 lunar cycles going over 3 years, the third line, first column in the table on display, one arrived at an error of 3.1 days per cycle or 1.03 day per year. Again, the last column on the right. Because this is not too bad a result, this was called triatoris. Consequently, the 8-year cycles of 99 lunations produces only an error of 0.2 days per year. Needless to say that there are plenty of references in the antiquity to this better cycle. As mentioned before, the Mesopotamians and Greeks stuck to the 235 lunation cycle, the Metonic cycle, which resulted in a precision where once in 19 years, roughly only 1 hour was missing. The Celtic cycle mentioned by Pliny has on an annual base practically the same exactitude as the Mediterranean Metonic cycle. As we can see from Pliny's remark, the Celts firmly understood that the mechanics of multiplying lunar cycles resulted in a stable calendar. The longer the cycles, the more precise these cycles became. The calendar of Coligny, of which bronze tablets were found in central Gaul, you see a little impression on the bottom right, displays a full developed Celtic calendar, which consisted of a multiplication of 6 times 5 lunar years, combined with a sophisticated regular pattern of intercalary months in yellow. In this context, it is important to stress that such patterns, the grey months took 29 days, the white ones 30 days, due to their regularity, didn't require literacy. Hence, the often heard argument that sophisticated calendars weren't possible within illiterate societies falls apart when studying the details of the Coligny calendar. Even the famous Nebra disk, dating to 1500 BC, fixes the solar solstices. The two golden bands on the left and right sides of the disk exactly fit to the solar path of the horizon. The new moon is shown standing beside the Pleiades, which are situated 4 degrees above the path of the sun, a couple of thousands of kilometers away in Mesopotamia. They were dealing at the same time with exactly the same issue. When the new moon appeared beside the Pleiades, it was the beginning of Nisan, the beginning of spring. For the ancient observer, sunset slowly moves towards its extreme in midsummer, and over nearly 2 weeks the sun will continue to set on virtually the same extreme place for several days, which is for the observer of the horizon a true standstill of the sun. So it stops nearly near the turning point. However, the moon is due to the speed of its setting times along the horizon through the period of 1 month more difficult to fix exactly at the extremes of its moonset points. Each day it will have moved up or down along the horizon a good number of degrees, which also means that the moonset on one day can be just a few degrees before the extreme turning point, and on the next day the fast-moving point of the moonset may already be on the way back and missed this extreme point. In general, the moonset may touch the extreme point somewhere during the year of the lunar standstill, but there is a high chance that one misses the very precise time at which this happens just from pure observation of the horizon. Here I would like to make a side remark about the work of Alexander Thom. His idea of fixing the lunar standstill points at the horizon with a couple of stakes cannot have functioned for the reason I am demonstrating here. From the astronomical point of view, this is just too sophisticated modern thinking. Around 300 BC, they were capable of calculating the path of the moon bandwidth with high precision, and hence only from that period on would one expect calculations of very precise moon positions at the horizon. The ancients were fully aware of the general bandwidth of the path of the moon. Already in the Moula Pin, now in the British Museum and dated 687 BC, they recorded which constellations were touched by the path of the moon. So they listed 17 constellations, not only the 12 constellations which consist of the zodiac. So, when it was difficult to fix the lunar standstill points at the horizon itself, how did they do it, if at all? With a little trick, the bandwidth of the lunar standstill horizon points can be fixed with very simple resources. Just take a wooden plank and measure the distance between the ecliptic, the path of the sun, and the star Eta within the constellation Leo, which star is being touched by the moon when it is at its extremes of the lunar path bandwidth. Then wait for midwinter, when the sun rises for nearly 2 weeks on the same spot on the horizon, as we've seen before. When the sky is veiled by thin cloud, it is very possible to look into the direction of the sun. By tracking the path of the sun with the edge of the plank, at the moment the bottom right corner of this wooden plank touches the horizon, you've got the position of the lunar standstill. That's simple. The burial mound of Magdalenenberg near Villingen-Schwenningen in the German Black Forest is the largest funeral monument known datable to the early Celtic period, the so-called Hallstatt period. It had a central tomb chamber which had already been partly looted in antiquity. Its magnificent setting, with an uninterrupted view of 300 kilometers towards the southeast, where you can see the Alps, is even today impressive. Systematic excavations in the 1970s resulted in a general plan which revealed some 130 tombs in two semicircles of burials, in which the heads of the bodies were orientated towards a turning point in the southeast. So the heads are going this way in that direction, and the heads in the south follow this direction and meet each other at this turning point. Soil conditions for organic remnants were exceptional good. Huge rows of wooden posts were situated diagonally through the burial mound. They were positioned before the burial mound was made. Towards the south, another large row of wooden posts was even braced with supporting timbers. All the rows must have been visible above the burial mound surface. Putting things together, the general plan turned out to be a surprisingly complete picture of a structured astronomical knowledgement or awareness in the early Celtic period. The axes of the wooden rows are pointing at specific points at the horizon, which can be identified as the places where the moon has its extreme rising positions. The pattern of the burials around the central tomb is easily recognizable as the sky constellations visible at midsummer directly after sunset, or based on the symmetry of the celestial processes during the seasons at midwinter just before sunrise. The sequence of the sky constellations is the same as we can see nowadays above us. Clockwise from the north, Little Bear, Dragon, Great Bear, the herdsman Boötes, North Crown, Hercules, Lyra, with the most luminant star known as Vega given a double burial, then the Swan, the Dolphin, Sea Voice and Cassiopeia. A special note should be made about the north orientation, where nowadays the end of the tail of the little bear, the so-called when nowadays the end of the little bear, one sees the celestial North Star. Due to the movement of the north point, the so-called precession, in the early Celtic period, the north was between the tail of the dragon and the tail of the little bear. This is exactly as it is displayed at Magdalenenberg. The third big row you see is going straight to the south here and laying underneath these sky constellations. A few words about the dating of the burial mound. The starting date of the wooden row construction given by general chronology is between 618 and 616 BC, and many probes from the central tomb chamber are datable to 614 BC. The finds from the graves firmly confirm this date within the so-called Hallstatt period D. General chronological dates from some of the burials suggest that the mound was used for burial for at least 25 years. This is important to notice because the concept of organizing the burials in a strict pattern of sky constellations, or even the orientation of the head towards a specific point towards the southeast, was apparently not done as a single event, but continued throughout more than 2 decades. Other burial mounds show similar organizational features, but not the wooden structures, which are currently only known from Magdalenenberg. Dattingen near Freiburg was a much smaller burial mound, but the same circular arrangement of the tombs are orientated to exactly the same point of a lunar standstill in the southeast, as we have seen at the Magdalenenberg. A variant of this spatial organization is known from Brassey in Burgundy, also in the main settlement area of the Hallstatt people. In this case, the semicircular orientation is towards the most extreme northeastern moonset. The same is valid for the burial mound of Courtesul in eastern Burgundy, where the semicircular pattern ends at the lunar standstill point. Again, at the burial mound of Diaville, the same pattern returns. And there are more examples. This Peculiar orientation is also used as a guideline in the famous burial chamber of Hochdorf near Stuttgart. The diagonal axes of the main burial chamber have the same orientation. Last but not least, the burial mound at the Oppidum of the Glauberg, north of Frankfurt, which had 2 statues erected at the burial mound, is accompanied by the huge so-called Prozessionsstraße, the partial reconstruction of which can be seen here from the air, and which continued another 200 meters underneath the Mainz fields towards the bottom right. It had exactly the same orientation. At the major southern lunar standstill event in 2006, at the Glauberg, the moon rose exactly on the horizon to where Prozessionsstraße points to. To summarize, there is a series of early Celtic funeral monuments in southern Germany and Burgundy where the lunar standstill orientations apparently played a remarkable dominant role, way beyond any accidental grouping. It also demonstrates the joint common cultural understanding between these 2 separate territories, which is an important contribution to the discussion as to how strong the cultural identity of the separate early Celtic regions must have been. I think that the evidence produced this evening shows that this group of tumuli confirms the archaeoastronomical proposition of Professor Clive Ruggles that only repeating orientations can be used to confirm our belief that these orientations were meaningful. This phenomenon of emblematic grave orientations can be compared with the early medieval Alemannic cemeteries from the 5th and 6th century in southern Germany, where the bodies were buried with the head principally directed towards the east. If we did not know about the Bible and its interpretation by the Church Fathers, the least daring explanation of such orientations would be to describe them as religious, sacral. But would we be able additionally to interpret this orientation as connected with the hope of resurrection without having knowledge of the Bible? The orientations in the cemetery have among themselves a variance of up to 20 degrees away from the main eastern direction. Would that work with an archaeoastronomical interpretation where orientation is the sole principle? But we do have written sources of ancient authors who have left us glimpses of knowledge about what once has been a Celtic moon-based culture, destroyed by the wars waged by the Romans. Plutarch and Pliny state very clearly that the calendar cycle of the Celts took 30 years. Emphasized in red. That is the cycle given in the Coligny calendar. Diodorus Siculus has a reference to the 19-year cycle referring to the low position of the moon, which occurs every 18.6 years. Therefore, it is very likely that he is referring to the lunar standstill cycle. The core 5 year blocks in the cycle of the Coligny calendar is mentioned in another text of Diodorus Siculus. It's the bottom text. Caesar must be considered as a primary source on Celtic astronomical knowledge. He did not only spend more than 7 years of his life killing an estimated 1 million of Gauls during the Gaulish guerrilla wars, but he was also in his function as Pontifex Maximus, responsible for the operation of the Roman calendar. Caesar's remarks are so essential for this study that I would like to read them in full. Report says that in the schools of the Druids they learn by heart a great number of verses, and therefore some persons remain 20 years under training, and they do not think it proper to commit these utterances to writing, although in almost all other matters, and in their public and private accounts they make use of Greek letters. I believe that they have adopted the practice for 2 reasons. that they do not wish the rule to become common property, nor those who learn the rule to rely on writing and so neglect the cultivation of the memory. The cardinal doctrine which they seek to teach is that souls do not die, but after death pass from one to other. And this belief, as the fear of death is thereby cast aside, they hold to be the greatest incentive to valor. Besides this, they have many discussions as touching the stars and their movement. The lunar standstill cycle is mentioned by the great astronomer Ptolemy. Remarkable, he mentions the lunar standstill cycle en passant, as if it was a well-known phenomenon. Although Ptolemy's fame is, rightly, based on his book Almagest with astronomical observations, which remained valid for over 1,000 years and was still in use by Columbus when he was navigating to America, he also wrote a thick astrological book, the Tetrabiblos. In this, he associates the lunar standstill and the position of the constellations with conditions affecting favorable or unfavorable births. It depends on certain constellations of the stars and the occurrence of a lunar standstill whether a person will be born healthy or not. He says, if the malefics be brought up to the luminaries, especially when the moon may be in her nodes or in her bend, the body will then be afflicted with distortions, lameness, or paralysis. I would like to stress at this point that this has nothing to do with modern astrology, because in current popular magazines, stars themselves are considered to be influential, whereas for the ancient people, the gods were moving the stars. So they should be read as signs of the gods. As an archaeologist, I do not believe a single piece of the modern variety of astrology. Now, combining the irrefutable fact brought by the many sources that the Celts were convinced of the idea of reincarnation, it is difficult to avoid the suspicion that when they applied regular patterns of the lunar standstill cycle to the tumuli, they were eventually hoping for a healthy rebirth. As Caesar explicitly points out, hopefully a rebirth as another fearless warrior. This interpretation by Ptolemy is relevant to our cultural understanding of the Celts. I do admit that it assumes the transportation of knowledge from the Mediterranean into the area north of the Alps. Any engagement with astronomy implies cross-cultural observation, be it only for the required long distances between eclipse observations. Ptolemy himself was studying 800 years old eclipse cycles from Mesopotamia, roughly 2,500 kilometers away. In archaeological terms, the early Celts in Burgundy and southern Germany were importing large quantities of red figure wares from Greece. It is my personal opinion that this has nothing to do with beads for the barbarians, as it is usually tacitly assumed, but the import of goods also implies the possibility of an underlying import of cultural concepts, and it is here that I see an explanation for the remarkable appearance of lunar standstill symbolism in this consistent group of early Celtic burial tumuli. As I pointed out earlier, one cannot expect very precise measurements of astronomical phenomena before 300 BC, for the simple reason that they couldn't even calculate them before that time in Mesopotamia. The symbolic character of the few but indisputable astronomical constellation images of the Denderah dome from Egypt on the left make it clear that we cannot look with our modern sky map at the back of our minds towards these ancient monuments. Even the Mesopotamians, who were able to calculate the positions of stars with precision of 6 decimal places, did not feel that they should depict a precise map of Gemini on the Assyrian disc in the British Museum on the right. The text does say, however, that this is Gemini. The modern sky map on top of this ancient Gemini depiction shows how much distortion was in fact accepted. The same is valid for the constellations of Magdalenenberg, Tumulus, They are easily recognizable, but do not extremely precise fit on modern sky maps. I think we have seen today that the Celts had access to knowledge which belies the image of them as drunken, brawling barbarians. This cannot have been a wholly primitive culture. The priests that learned by heart the regularities of the moon cycles, as we have seen at the colony calendar, are not likely to have been constantly fooled by amphora of alcohol. On the other hand, I hope to answer your further questions later on with the encouragement of a bit of alcohol in the sherry, or even just right now. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to invite you also, I've brought with me a couple of prints from an article, unfortunately in German. So if someone is interested, I will lay them out there. They are free to take with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. We'd like some questions on this from parallel universes, parallel interests in other cultures. Okay, Mark, will you start?
Well, I found that absolutely fascinating, but I found it very difficult for me as a sort of totally unscientific person to really follow. I should say, though, that you did keep me awake, which is actually quite an achievement. I would like to ask a question which may be unfair, and perhaps I shouldn't be asking it anyway, and if so, Howard can tell me to no, we're not going to answer that one. But just for you, as an archaeoastronomer or whatever, Stonehenge, when people talk about it, they never seem to talk, at least in what I've read, about the two trilithons to the left and the two trilithons to the right in the central horseshoe feature. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about those, perhaps in relation to lunar standstills or whatever. And really, the second, in a way, part of the same question is, you've mentioned your offering, which I would very dearly like to have one of the copies, but can you suggest perhaps afterwards reading lists or things by Ruggles or whatever, hopefully in English, but if necessary, in Dutch.
Yeah.
Dank je wel.
Thank you. More questions, please. Okay, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. Is there any physical evidence within inside your monuments for total or partial eclipses being recorded with posts or stones?
Eclipses?
Yes, total or partial eclipses. Because those would, to me, seem to be exceptional events that only occur once every so often, so it would be rather bizarre to me.
Did you gather the involved with that question? Okay, come back.
Many of the burials you talked about, are some of the most well-furnished and richest burials in Hallstatt period. Do you see this knowledge being held by the more common people, or is it knowledge that's restricted to the elite, as you were talking about with Julius Caesar towards the end of your lecture?
Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you. The laying out of the burials according to the constellations seems to have implications, presumably for their contemporary age. The fact that they were laid out according to a pre-planned arrangement. I wonder if you could comment. Excuse me. If you could comment on the archaeological evidence for the dating of that and how
That's right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, Chris.
One more question. I find your proposition that major theory monuments are laid out according to a cosmological scheme extremely persuasive, it's cross-culturally true. What I'm interested in is there anything in later Celtic funerary rite or other aspects of material culture, post-culture, which also gives evidence for a continuation development of this set beliefs?
I think that's plenty to work with, yes.
As for Stonehenge, it is a bit like the disc of Nebra. People are complaining every week a new theory pops up of how this should have worked. It is a bit my approach that we should possibly leave the idea of an observatory in a modern sense. If there are films being produced by National Geographic, and people standing, why? Yet now the moment has been arrived. Stonehenge is such a separate thing. It's, I think you cannot compare it with this more local chiefs of the Hallstatt period. The amount of work invested in Stonehenge is simply something different. So I wouldn't dare even to compare Stonehenge with but again, I think looking for in a single monument for a specific astronomical event is, as Professor Clive Rudders rightly pointed out, a dangerous thing. I think his statement, you must have a series of monuments where this observation fits to, he has written terrifically on this in his book Archäologische in Britton and Ireland. I think it's 15-20 years ago published. A superb book. I highly admire it. The eclipses were unavoidable to avoid observing, because they are the only things which really can be fixed to the hour. If you look at the full moon, you cannot really say is it today full moon or is it tomorrow full moon. And that is difficult, even by someone who's really interested. Eclipses are exactly, full eclipses are exactly fetchable by the hour. So the precision where this colony points at, I think assumes also that they were working with the same precision by eclipse observation and registration. I think it's just inherent on doing building a calendar, like the Mespotamians did with the Saros cycle. We don't have records for it that they were doing it, but anyone who is trying to establish a calendar, there's no way around it. Whether this knowledge was I think it was indeed limited to the upper classes, if you might say. These burial mounds, especially Magdalenenberg, 130 people buried around it, the chief in the central tomb, that was elite knowledge. But Caesar describes it exactly like that. The people, the young guys, were being sent for 20 years learning in this elite group called druids, doesn't matter. But so they were taken away out of normal society and learned these things in the elite groups. Yeah, that I think is clear, and it is not by accident that this specialized knowledge appears when the societies themselves, like the Hallstatt, also establish, let's say, elite groups, right? Like these chiefs or kings, Fürsten, Gräber, as they are called. So I think it fits together. You need an elite to develop this sort of knowledge. And as for the burial layouts, I don't know how they solved it. So these posts were visible above the earth on the tumulus mound. I think we should accept that they had a plan, or a map, so to say, where do we think that, or know where the constellation should be, and they followed it over 25 years. I think they were not just looking around where's the next free place to put a just recently died person in. They had a concept of it, and how they registered this concept, we just don't know. To me, that's also, I don't know, I can't explain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing this knowledge with us, and I'm sure there's a lot more to come. The one comment I would make, the interesting thing that I come to this as an architecture historian, later buildings, I do not walk these sorts of landscapes. I walk amongst buildings and paintings and things for my daily work, and that's so one of the places I ran into some of these issues and therefore got a sense of how these things operated was at the very sophisticated later end of culture. I was in the Yantar-Mantar observatories in Rajasthan, where Jai Singh put up these 18th century, in the 18th century, built these places. And it's really, what struck me about places like that is that it's really like walking around an 18th century country house library, like Houghton or, Wimpole or some of our great 18th century buildings where you pull together cultures, because there's a lot in those sites. I only saw the one at Jaipur, but of course there are the remains of others in Delhi and other places, bringing together Hindu and Muslim culture about sun and moon cultures, and observing those things. But the one thing I would say as a non-archaeologist that interests me, and obviously more and more things are coming out of the ground, and it does seem to be what time I've got to observe all the sort of things that are said about Stonehenge, for example, is that archaeologists work with these almost abstract forms of symbolism and of placing things, and at times of year and eclipses and that sort of thing. What we're all interested in as historians too is the daily life of these sites. That's to say, when they're constructed, how did people behave and operate within them? And one of the things that I learned from the site in Jaipur was that this observatory was used to predict the coming of the monsoon. That's to say, it had an active seasonal or annual use in terms of determining the weather. So that I just wonder, obviously archaeological remains, the physical remains in the ground that are coming up now, are telling us more about people who lived there, died there, perhaps were buried there, but also about things that they did in these sites on a more regular basis. The huge range there, therefore, of interesting things that we can all think about and share. Anyway, thank you very much for bringing this very special, and certainly all the photographs I looked at on the internet earlier today of this, it clearly is quite a magical place. And your aerial view of the other one with clearly its visitor centre, I take it, and the mound and the avenue, these are quite special magical sites for us, and I hope one day to get to see it. Thank you very much.